Yeah, and well, actually, I've told the story before, but it was so. I knew Chris from the time he was a teenager because he was one of the group that would always be coming with Dennis Corluzzo, right? When we go to Ribbit for the feeding frenzies after the Philly Civic Center shows for the NWA, and but then I would eat everything on the menu, and Dennis he gave us incredible treatment where he would have a private room for us and the whole group that hung out with him, whether it be, Donnie B or Fat Gino or, Dapper Johnny, the whole Philadelphia wrestling mafia. But there was this kid, quiet, humble, soft-spoken kid. And a couple of times, Tammy was with him. And then as we got started with Smoky Mountain Wrestling, he had been calling me and saying, hey, I'd love to come. And to be honest, maybe I'm alone in groups of wrestling promoters. I couldn't figure a way that I could bring Chris Candido from New Jersey to Knoxville and make him enough money to support himself. And I told him that. I said, Chris, I'd love to have you. I've seen, a few of your matches and you're great, but I can't right now pay you enough money that, you'd be able to live. And honesty, I guess, was such a shocking concept from a promoter that he thought I was putting him off and just didn't want to use him and was just trying to give him a bullshit story. But then I had seen Tammy. I'm trying to think where I first saw her in that light. I think it may have been the Gordon Scazzari debacle with that AWF or what up in Massachusetts in 91 or 92 or whatever it was. And she was there taking pictures because Chris was there at the show. And she's such a pretty girl and also kind of, with it when you talk to her, with the wrestling business and understood what was going on. And so I called him. Then I had the idea. I said, you know what? I can't pay either one of them individually, but since they're a couple, I could pay both of them a little bit of money, but together, two can live as cheaply, whatever that old phrase is.
Yep.
And so I called him up and asked him, I said, you both want to come? And he kind of had to talk, or I did, Tammy into it a little bit because she was in school, I guess. She was planning to become a nurse. Maybe it's all my fault. I don't know. Take credit for it. But she said, well, I could transfer to the University of Tennessee and I could finish my courses. And not only did Chris want to jump at the chance to work in Smoky Mountain, an old-fashioned territory because he loved the business so much, but also I think she was kind of like, well, this could be interesting. But once again, at first, she was the one that wasn't really that interested. And little did we know what would happen later. She'd end up, unfortunately, being, well, not unfortunately, but she would end up being the big. So anyway, they came down, and she did enroll in school. And to the best that I remember, I think she finished her classes because she was always doing homework. Were you there when she was doing homework in the locker room?
Not in the locker room, but when I was there, Tina and I lived in the same apartment complex, and I think she was still taking classes. So,
yeah. So anyway, I mean, she did what she said she was going to do, and originally, my thought was Chris was a young guy, and he had all the potential in the world, and all the drive and the dedication, but he had never really worked anywhere except the independents in the Northeast, and maybe he'd been to Memphis for a week or two. So I couldn't start him on top because he didn't really have the experience. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start Chris. My long-term plans were for him. I didn't know how she was going to work out because she had never done this before. But my long-term plan was to start Chris out as an underneath guy, but coming in, and Dennis Corluzzo lent the belt that Chris had that he held for Dennis's shows and even did a couple promos, I think, for him at the time. But he would come in underneath as real WWA junior heavyweight champion or whatever. And I had him work with Horner because one thing you say about Tim, he was a good basic worker where he could evaluate a guy and he could, lead somebody that didn't have a lot of experience working Southern wrestling along and kind of get the timing down and everything. And then he worked with Bobby Blaze for the belt because Bobby was so good. And they had, at the time, matches doing moves that nobody else, as you remember, in Smoky Mountain or anywhere else in the South were doing. The power bomb off the top rope. But the first time they did that, I almost shit myself.
And it wasn't the finish.
And it wasn't the finish. And, but that's why we started Chris in the middle, because to learn those things. And then, he gradually graduated to a main event spot where he and Brian Lee were the tag team champions, and he was figured into a lot of stuff. But a story to the idea of the power bomb that wasn't the finish. Chris's first TV taping, I remember, I can't remember who he was working with, but he threw the guy out on the floor, and we were at a high school gym, so this is a basketball floor. He throws the guy out on the floor, and he runs the other side of the ring, and he runs across the ring and dives over the top rope. Didn't touch anything. Did like a cannonball onto the fucking guy on the floor, and the splat. And I mean, my God, I felt it in my feet back in the locker room where I'm watching the monitor. He hit so hard. And all the people just went, like, what the fuck? Wow, that looked like that hurt everybody, right? They couldn't understand it. And he came back in, and I said, Chris, why did you do that? Didn't that hurt? He said, well, yeah, but, it was a big move. And I said, I tell you what, how about this? Next time you go out for the next show that we're doing that same night, instead of doing that and killing yourself and potentially killing the guy you're landing on, I said, take a couple of real quick arm drags or hip toss or a back drop or get drop kicked or whatever. Take a bump through the ropes. Fucking get mad, stomp around for a minute, kick the ring post, cross your arms over your chest, and pout with that baby face of yours. It looks like you're 12. He said, oh, okay. And he did it, because, of course, he did everything he asked him to do. And the people came unglued. You crybaby, you piece of shit, you blah, blah, blah. And he came back in and he said, what the? I said, you see? I said, it got over more with less damage. And then he started to understand that these people were looking at a wrestling match from a standpoint not of how fancy are the moves or how big is the bump, but you're a heel, so we don't like you, and we need a reason not to like you even more, and we're going to like the guy you're working with because he's a babyface, regardless of whether he's any good or not, because did I mention he was a babyface? And that's where and then they start chanting, cry baby, cry baby, cry baby. And that's where the crybaby Chris Candido thing came from, because now they had something to hang their hat on and something to really dislike about him, because he did have that baby face. It looked like he was 12 because he was only 19 or whatever. And that's how he's learning how to work and get heat rather than just going out. And unfortunately, even when he was in Knoxville, he had already done some damage to his body. And so later on, the thing started to, those big bumps he had taken, everything started to backfire. But at that point, at least we're teaching him how to get some longevity. But I'll never forget that, because he was just so stunned that he did this big thing and absolutely nobody in the building gave a shit. But he just pouted and got mad and threw a temper tantrum, and he had more heat than anybody on the show. Yeah,
that's what I learned in Smoky Mountain, too. I realized that you had to do the match the audience wanted to see, not the one you wanted to perform, because I was a bit in the same mode when I got there, and you smartened me up to that really quick.
And I know this about Chris, but another Chris, remember when Jericho took that bump where he went over the turnbuckles, head first into the ring post and straight down to the floor in front of like 200 people in Hayside, Virginia or whatever? I said, that's the greatest thing I've ever seen. Don't ever do it again until I tell you to. Yeah. And then I wanted him to do it in Knoxville on Night of the Legends when the 5,000 people there place was sold out, and that's when he broke his arm and couldn't do the fucking move. I was like, oh, okay. But another time with Tammy, I started her on top as a manager, because why have an underneath manager? And at the time, Hillary Clinton, much as now, was, especially in that part of the country, was not the most popular human being in the world. So that's where her background from Wellesley College, Hillary alma mater, and she's a northerner down south, and she's looking down at people and wants to find some big stupid men to manage. And that got her instant heat. And of course, her first interview, I'd never seen her talk. I'd talked to her, so I knew she could, but I didn't know how she could cut a promo. So I put her on a pre-tape with Bob Caudle where he could kind of lead her through it if she got lost, and I gave her some notes. This is the story I'd like you to tell. Put it in your own words. Not only did she put it exactly the way I had written it, but it sounded like it was her own words. So automatically she's off and running, and we got her Brian Lee. And then eventually, after Chris worked these different programs underneath and got a little more heat and got acclimated to how to have these matches down there, then instantly, he was ready for, well, not instantly, but he was ready for to be Brian's partner, and they were the tag team champions, and I finally reunited them, so to speak, although the people know they were ever together to begin with. But so a lot of people have asked me, why did you start Tammy off right at the top and bring Chris up through the ranks? Is because, well, all she had to do was talk and get heat, and Lord knows, as we now know and everybody in the world knows, she's good at both of those, whereas Chris needed the experience, and he turned into being one of the most accomplished workers, not only, I thought, athletically, but also psychologically in the business at that time. He loved the business, and he had it. And I remember, did you ever go to Welch, West Virginia for us?
No idea. I'm guessing not, but I don't know.
Well, you probably would remember it, but Welch, West Virginia on the map is not that far from Knoxville, Tennessee. But if you don't go the right way, and the right way is sticking to the 4-lane highways that's like 90 miles longer by the map, right? Mm-hmm. It will take you 4 hours longer to get there. And this is an example, once again, of a rib that didn't hurt anybody, didn't destroy anybody's private property, didn't cost them any money, just maybe some gray hairs and some frustration. But since we had the Yankees from New Jersey, and they'd never been really to West Virginia before, they're booked in Welch, West Virginia one night, and me and Hildebrand got together and told them, make sure you get there about 4 hours early because we need to shoot some promos, right? Okay, and instantly. And we told them, now you've got the map, right? Have you seen how to go? And they said, well, it looks like this is the straightest way, this road here through War, West Virginia, and all these other. We said, that's perfect. That's exactly how you need to go. And this 140-mile trip or whatever turned into a 5-hour excursion. That's why we told them to get there 4 hours early. And when they came in right at an hour before the matches, when they were supposed to legitimately get there, I mean, Chris is sweating and he's pacing. He's like, I'm so sorry. And me and Hildebrand bust up laughing because we knew what we had done to him. And then, of course, we said, when you go home, why don't you go this way? And they were home in like 2.5 hours. And they were like, oh, Jesus Christ. But that's, once again, we loved them, especially Chris. That's why we ribbed him politely and didn't destroy any property or anything. And I think there was a time that it was Rex King. Which one was he, Well or Dunn?
He was Timothy Well.
He was Well. Rex King was Timothy Well. And they were there at the time, and he was riding back with Chris and Tammy to Knoxville. And I remember hearing the story right as it happened. I don't remember all the details, but basically Rex was stirring Chris up that they should go to the strip club, and Tammy would have none of it. And of course, in those days, Tammy I don't think she'd ever taken a pill. She'd never drunk a beer, didn't do it in front of anybody. She had no bad habits whatsoever except for her natural personality, which is why I was using her to begin with. And she didn't want to go to no strip club. And Rex King kept jabbing Chris, you got no hair on your balls unless we go to the Mouse's Ear, the strip club, right? And finally, I think they ended up, I believe that was the night that if Tammy pitched such a fit about that they both got out of the car and Chris put her in the trunk for a couple of miles. And then they went to the Mouse's Ear and she wasn't happy about it, but they didn't stay long just to prove a point. But, once it was good-natured ribbing, but Chris was all in on stuff like that. He would do anything you asked. I just, I loved him.
Yeah, he really had that ability. He could do the comedy like the Crybaby stuff. He could do a really good match. He could do a ECW style match. He could do anything you needed him to do, and he was willing to do it all.
Well, and the thing is, he was kind of like Owen Hart. He could do comedy that the fans didn't realize at the time was comedy. Like when Owen and Mick had the hardcore match and beat each other with the bags of popcorn and were selling it, and the people were all going crazy. Chris had that personality and just that way of carrying himself that he could do funny stuff, but it put serious, legitimate heat on him because people didn't realize he was performing. They thought he really was, the putz that way. And another Chris story. Have you heard about his conversation with Lou Thez?
No, I've not.
Okay. Remember when the whole NWA title fiasco thing. Shane Douglas threw the belt down. Paulie birthed ECW. It was an asshole baby, whatever. They screwed the NWA on that deal, and it, you know, that didn't sit well with me. And, of course, it made Dennis Corluzzo look bad because he was standing there, and he was a friend of mine. So he asked me to send talent up to the second NWA World Title Tournament. And, you know, and that's when they put the belt on Chris, because it was Dennis's boy. And then later on, Chris dropped it on one of the ECW shows to Dan, or ECW, one of the Smoky Mountain shows to Dan Severn, the whole 9 years. But while Chris had the NWA belt, he was either flying home or he was flying to a shot in California he got booked for. One or the other, something like that. And in the airport bathroom, he looks over, and the person standing next to him is Lou Thez. And I'll never forget when as soon as he got back to Knoxville, and the first time I saw him at a show, he told me about this. He said, Mr. Thez. He introduced himself and said, I'm Chris Candido, and I'm working in Knoxville right now. And of course, Chris, he looked like he had the profile like young Eddie Graham, right? With that blonde hair, and he was stocky, and he was such a strong kid. Even though he wasn't tall and really big physically, you remember, he was a strong son of a gun. So he was, you know, he could carry the part, right? But he mentioned, and he wasn't being markish, but he mentioned that he was currently, you know, the NWA champion for what was left of the NWA. He wasn't trying to make it out like it was the same thing as when Thez was the champion, but he said, Thez looked at him and put his hand on his shoulder and said, son, if you're going to carry that belt, just be aware you're going to have to protect yourself against double crosses. And he didn't have the heart to tell Lou that, no, all the double crosses took place amongst the promoters' days and not the wrestlers anymore. But he was so proud of the fact that Lou Thez had warned him about potentially having to protect the belt because of double crosses that I think he remembered that the rest of his life.
That's awesome. All right. Thanks, Jimmy. I really appreciate you sharing your stories.
Hey, well, I appreciate it. Anything that we can do to remember Chris, because he was, you know, and I'll say this before I go. I know a lot of times, you know, guys have problems that they bring on themselves. I don't think that was the origin of Chris's issues. I think it was, and this is maybe a cautionary tale for the young guys out there, I think a lot of it was due to the damage that he did to himself, both before and after he worked in Knoxville, and even some of what he did in Knoxville, which still was off the charts for the time. And he told me one time he had an x-ray in his part of his bone. The bone was black, which apparently the doctor said indicated that it was dead. I didn't even know a bone could be dead. But, you know, I think that's where a lot of that came from. And then he got involved in cultures where things of that nature were, if not encouraged, at least not, you know, discouraged. And, you know, everybody out there, just remember, what's Rip Rogers say? You've only got so many bumps in your bump card. But if everybody could emulate the mental attitude, both in terms of in-ring psychology and just in terms of love of the business and a eagerness to learn and to do his job right, rather than just the bumps of guys like Candido and Mick Foley and all the rest, everybody in our business would be better off. And I will always love Chris Candido.